The Winchester Mystery House. It was said that Sarah Winchester could never escape the ghosts. They followed her wherever she went, whispering in the corners of rooms and materializing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the light. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she built, they would always find her. In the late 1800s, after the sudden death of her husband, William Winchester, heir to the vast fortune of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, Sarah found herself isolated in her grief. The death of her infant daughter just a few years earlier had already crushed her spirit, but now, the loss of her husband left her adrift. She was alone, save for one thing: the whispers of the dead. Those closest to Sarah whispered of her obsession with the occult. Some claimed she regularly held seances, desperately seeking guidance from the beyond. One particularly grim visit with a medium convinced her that the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were seeking revenge on the family that had profited from their deaths. The medium offered a dire warning. As long as Sarah remained in her current home, the spirits would find her. But there was a way to evade them, a way to appease the angry souls and keep them confused. The solution was as bizarre as it was chilling. She was to build and never stop. As long as she continued constructing her home, adding room after room, staircase after staircase, the spirits would remain lost and unable to find her. And so, Sarah packed her things, purchased an 8-room farmhouse in San Jose, California, and began what would become one of the most notorious architectural oddities in American history, the Winchester Mystery House. The workers at the house would later speak of the strange rhythm of construction, unlike anything they'd ever seen. There were no clear plans, no architectural blueprints. Instead, Sarah would direct them based on the messages she received during her nightly seances. In the dead of night, alone in her dark, candlelit seance room, she would ask the spirits what they wanted, where they were, and how to build to keep them at bay. At first, the additions to the house were fairly conventional: new rooms, a few extended hallways, perhaps a staircase or two. But as the years passed, the mansion grew into something much stranger. There were staircases that led to nowhere, abruptly stopping at ceilings or walls. Doors opened into empty space or led directly into solid walls. Some hallways twisted and turned, looping back onto themselves, while others were so narrow they could barely fit a person. The house, once a simple farmhouse, transformed into a labyrinth, an architectural nightmare. But for Sarah, it was her salvation. She moved through the ever-expanding mansion as though it were a living thing, navigating the confusion with ease, while outsiders struggled to make sense of it. Every night, Sarah met with the spirits. And every day, construction continued, non-stop, 24 hours a day, for nearly 4 decades. But even as the house grew, so did the terror within its walls. Workers began to report strange occurrences as they built. At first, it was minor things. Tools would disappear and reappear in different rooms, or they'd hear footsteps in the hallways when no one was there. Some chalked it up to the house's confusing layout. After all, with hallways that twisted on themselves and rooms that seemed to appear out of nowhere, it was easy to get disoriented. But soon, the workers were experiencing things they couldn't explain away so easily. They would hear disembodied voices, faint but persistent, murmuring their names from empty rooms. Figures would appear in the corners of their vision, only to vanish when they turned to look. The temperature in certain rooms would plummet, their breath visible in the summer heat, as though an unseen presence had entered the space with them. One worker, a man named Jacob, was sent to repair a door that had mysteriously jammed shut on the 3rd floor. As he approached the door, he heard the unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing from the other side. Assuming it was Mrs. Winchester herself, he knocked lightly and called out to her. The sobbing stopped immediately, replaced by silence so oppressive it made his skin crawl. When he opened the door, the room was completely empty. But the air inside was icy, and in the center of the floor, a single child's rocking chair swayed gently back and forth, though there was no wind and no one had been in the room for hours. Jacob quit the next day. The story spread quickly among the workers. No one stayed on the job long, but Sarah Winchester always found more willing hands, at least for a time. She remained a reclusive figure in the house, her thin frame moving silently through the rooms and corridors, always watching, always listening. It was said that she had become obsessed with the spirits, that she never slept for fear they would find her. Those who had the rare opportunity to speak with her during this period described her as someone consumed by a deep, abiding fear. Her eyes, once sharp and intelligent, were now sunken, haunted by unseen horrors. She would mutter to herself, her fingers trembling as she traced the walls of her home, as though sensing the invisible entities trapped within the twisting hallways and dead-end corridors. But the house, in all its disorienting complexity, did not protect Sarah as well as she hoped. One night, in 1906, a massive earthquake struck San Jose, rattling the foundation of the mansion. The quake brought destruction to the area, but to the Winchester house, it seemed to bring something more. The house shifted and groaned as though alive, parts of it collapsing into themselves. The seance room where Sarah had spent so many nights communing with the dead was buried under debris. She was trapped inside, left in total darkness for hours. When her workers finally freed her, she emerged pale, shaken, and whispering that the spirits were angry, that they had found her. The earthquake had, in some way, disturbed the delicate balance she had tried to maintain with the spirits. The walls between her and the restless souls had cracked, just like the walls of her house. The spirits were closer now, angrier, and she could feel their presence growing stronger with every passing day. From that moment on, Sarah's behavior grew more erratic. She became consumed with the idea of building more, adding new wings to the house, constructing new layers of confusion. She believed that if she could only create enough chaos within the walls, the spirits would never find their way to her again. But the construction that had once seemed to offer her protection now seemed to deepen her fear. She began hearing the whispers more clearly, seeing shapes in the corners of her vision more often. The house, once her sanctuary, had become a prison, an intricate web of fear and paranoia, trapping both her and the spirits within. As the years dragged on, the house grew even more bizarre, almost taking on a life of its own. Rooms seemed to appear overnight, as though built by invisible hands, and staircases seemed to shift when no one was looking. The workers swore they heard hammering at night when no one should have been working. Sarah became more reclusive, retreating to her personal quarters for longer periods of time, often locking herself in for days without seeing a soul. Her hair grew unkempt, her eyes more hollowed and distant, as if she were losing herself to the labyrinth she had created. The workers who stayed on the job were filled with unease. They whispered of the strange happenings that plagued the house. Some said they had seen Sarah wandering the halls late at night, talking to figures that weren't there, or sitting in front of doors that led nowhere, as if awaiting someone or something. They spoke of cold drafts in rooms that should have been warm, of objects moving by themselves, and of voices in the walls. One evening, Sarah's longtime housekeeper, Mary, decided to visit her mistress's room, concerned after Sarah had been locked inside for nearly 3 days. She knocked gently, but there was no response. The air outside the door felt unnaturally cold. After a moment of hesitation, Mary cautiously opened the door. The sight inside chilled her to the bone. Sarah was standing in the center of the room, her back to the door. The room was dark, lit only by a single candle on a table, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the darkness that unnerved Mary. It was the feeling that someone else was in the room, watching from just beyond the candle's light. "Mrs. Winchester." Mary's voice trembled. Sarah did not turn around. Her thin frame stood rigid, her hands hanging limply by her sides. The only movement came from her lips, which were moving rapidly, whispering something unintelligible. Suddenly, the door to the seance room, long sealed shut after the earthquake, swung open on its own. The The temperature in the room dropped even further, and a low, droning sound filled the air, like the hum of a far-off chant. It felt as though something had been waiting behind that door for years, waiting for this moment to be released. Panicking, Mary backed away, slamming the door behind her as she fled. She never entered that room again. The final days of Sarah Winchester's life were cloaked in mystery. On September 5, 1922, she died in her sleep, but the house remained as restless as ever. Some say that on the night of her death, workers reported hearing a thunderous crash echo through the mansion, as if the very walls were mourning her passing. The construction, which had continued without pause for 38 years, came to a sudden, jarring halt. When Sarah was gone, the house finally stood still, but the spirits did not. After her death, the mansion was open to the public, and it didn't take long for reports of paranormal activity to surface. Visitors claimed to see shadowy figures moving through the halls, disembodied voices calling out in the dead of night, and cold spots that chilled them to the bone. Some saw apparitions of former workers still carrying their tools, eternally trapped in the endless construction that had defined the mansion for decades. Others claimed to have glimpsed Sarah herself, wandering the halls of her creation, searching for a way out that she never found in life. Even to this day, the Winchester Mystery House stands as a monument to fear, madness, and the unknown. Visitors often feel as though they are being watched as they walk through the twisted hallways, as though the very walls are alive with unseen eyes. Doors creak open on their own, and staircases still lead to nowhere. As if the house itself is keeping secrets it will never fully reveal. Sarah Winchester built the house to confuse the spirits that haunted her, but in the end, it seemed she had only trapped them inside its walls forever.